Hey, welcome. Well, my name is Kirsten Graham, and I am the Advocacy and Outreach co-chair from the Junior League of Long Beach, and I'll be your moderator for this Objectivity, Cultural Competency, and Racial Biases breakout session. So shared with you today is a slide, as you can see, that are just prompting questions that each candidate may choose to address as part of their speaking time. Each candidate will have 4.5 minutes to speak, and the order of each speaker has already been randomly assigned, so I'll let you know when to begin. And then if anybody watching in our breakout room has any questions they would like to ask, time permitting, just submit them to the chat box, and we will address them at the end if there is time. This breakout session will be 30 minutes long and is being recorded and will be posted on the League of Women Voters website for public viewing. At the end of the 30 minutes, all participants will be brought back to the primary room where we'll hear some closing comments. So we will start with Carol Elswick, and your 4.5 minutes begins now.
Good evening, and I'm pleased to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I feel like judges, like everyone else, are human beings, and therefore, in my opinion, like everyone else, judges do exhibit implicit bias. Having 30 years of judicial experience, I apply law to the facts that are presented to me and rule accordingly. And to ensure that my decisions are not unduly influenced by possible implicit bias, I'm mindful to ask myself, has a person's race, person's ethnicities, religious beliefs, or lack thereof, their sexual identification, their social economic status, their disability, their citizenship status, their immigration status, their mental health status, has that influenced my rulings or my decisions? I think that's very important. It takes a number of years on the bench to recognize that we all have implicit bias. And I constantly ask myself, again, those questions, has that influenced my ruling or my decisions? And I think that's very important. At the same time, I want to follow that up with the following. When I perceive, sometimes I do perceive, my attorneys in the courtroom, I should say the attorneys that are assigned to my courtroom, sometimes they might be influenced, unduly influenced by implicit bias. And I ask them to distinguish the facts in case A from case B to ascertain the reasons for perhaps an increased prison sentence or increased jail time, increased community labor, community service. I'm going to ask them to distinguish the facts in case A from case B to make sure that that implicit bias does not affect the persons before the court. And I think that's very, very important. Sometimes they say, well, Your Honor, this case is a little different because of A, B, or C. And I say, let's take a look at the criminal history. Are their criminal histories the same? There's no criminal history. And I just have to dig deeper to find out, why are you treating A different from B? And sometimes they can't give me an answer. And if I can't get an answer from them, I invite them up to the bench so I can we'll go off the record and I say, hey, look, I'm not seeing a difference here. And sometimes they'll be honest with me and say, well, so-and-so went to a good school. So-and-so has a good job. And I'll say to them, well, wait a minute here. Just because someone went to a good school or has a good job doesn't mean they get a lighter sentence. Okay, we have to be fair, we have to be equal. Someone who doesn't have the advantages of going to a good school or doesn't have the advantage of having a good job shouldn't get a lighter sentence. And that's the implicit bias sometimes. Sometimes it isn't always race or ethnicity. Sometimes it's somebody doesn't have particular advantages. And so I'm always mindful of that, whether it's myself or the lawyers or the parties involved, and that's very, very important. I do look forward to your questions. I'm happy to answer some of those questions. I'll even go to another part of some of the sub questions that you have. With respect to, I think one of the questions was, how do we increase diversity on the bench or those sorts of things? Just last week, I was up at the California Judges Association mid-year conference. One of the breakout sessions included diversity and inclusivity and how do judges build bridges. And we talked about how do we build bridges by way of mentoring and internships. And that was an hour, I think an hour and 15 minutes in that particular breakout session that I attended. And just today I spoke with one of my interns from years ago, 2004. We've been in a friendship ever since then. One of those interns was a Cal Poly student. She was interested in becoming a lawyer, a criminal lawyer. And so she was with me for about 3 months. After completing that, she graduated from Cal Poly. She ended up being a tutor for my children from grade school in the area of math through college, or entering college. And as I said, we've remained friends. She's currently, she didn't follow her aspirations of going to law school, but then she became an entrepreneur. She is a person of color. She currently in her business has a tutor.
Carol, that's your time.
I'm sorry.
No
Thank
worries.
you. Look forward to your
Mhm.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and then we have Carolyn Jiyoung Park, and your time begins now.
Thank you. So my my view is that judges absolutely exhibit implicit bias. As the previous speaker said, we all as human beings have implicit biases to some degree, but it's incumbent upon us as legal workers, attorneys, and judicial candidates to do the self-examination and do the internal work of debiasing ourselves. It's so that we can be the best attorneys and judges that we can be. So my view of bias and race and objectivity is very much informed by critical race theory, which says that race is a social construct and that our institutions, including the criminal justice system, education system, our workplaces, are laced with racism embedded in our laws, our regulations, our rules, and that these laws and regulations and rules and procedures lead to different outcomes by race and disproportionately affect especially African American and Latino populations. And the problem with implicit bias is that you don't know what you don't know. And even when you do know, it's extremely difficult to be completely unbiased or to extricate oneself from the various isms in our institutions. And it's also difficult to not uphold in some way the unfair institutions that we have. That said, we have to do the best that we can. And so I'm interested in how we can tackle this monumental problem. And one of those ways is, as I've alluded to, is to do our individual work on ourselves. We have to, in order to be aware of our implicit biases, we can read about critical race theory. We can learn about history, the history of injustice in this country. I was a history major and an Africa and diaspora studies major. And I've also intentionally made myself a part of diverse communities, and being part of diverse communities is also a way of debiasing ourselves. I've also chosen a career representing people from all walks of life. So as a staff attorney and as an attorney in private practice working in civil rights and many other matters, I've represented people from, indigent folks to custodians to tax auditors and nurses, and that to deal directly with people who are system impacted is also how we can break down implicit biases so that we can view every party that comes through the court system as a full human being with hopes and dreams and families and lives that are impacted in various ways by our legal systems.
Time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm. And next we have Elizabeth Lashley-Haynes, and your time begins now.
Yes, thanks so much, Ms. Graham. This is one of the topics that's very near and dear to me, so I'm really honored to be able to be here with everyone and discuss all of these really important issues. I'll take the first question, which is, do I believe that judges exhibit implicit bias? That would be a definite yes, because as several of the other speakers have mentioned, we all have implicit bias. It's not solely judges, but it's everyone. I think what is extremely important is that if judges don't recognize their implicit bias and try to counteract that, the results of that can be extremely dangerous. So if all human beings have implicit bias, but you work at a grocery store, that may not have a horrible, dangerous sort of impact. But for a judge, unaddressed implicit bias could be result in extremely inequitable outcomes in people's lives and liberty. So I have very particular experience with this because currently right now my job is to litigate the Racial Justice Act. This was a bill passed, it's Assembly Bill 2542. It was codified into Penal Code Section 745. It's a new law that deals explicitly with implicit bias in our legal system. So I have brought claims of implicit bias and I've brought them in multiple courtrooms throughout the county. One of the common things that I see is that there are judges, not all, but there are judges that don't understand what implicit bias means. And I see that in the way that they're ruling on my Racial Justice Act claims. So they bring up explicit bias and they'll claim like, well, you didn't show how this particular client, there was racism against this client. And I try to explain, well, no, this is implicit structural racism. And the judges I see after a long time of litigating it, that they don't really understand what implicit bias means. And to me, again, that's very dangerous. If you don't really even understand what it means, then how could you work to recognize your own bias? I would say that I am a part of a statewide group that works on the Racial Justice Act. And one of the things we've been discussing is more training for judges throughout the state of California on implicit bias. In terms of what I would do to ensure that my decisions, if I were on the court, were not unduly influenced, I've thought a lot about this. And there's a concept in the prosecutorial world called blind filings, where some more progressive prosecutors have the name, the identifying characteristics about the people who are arrested blacked out, so that they are not influenced by that when they make decisions about how to file a case, what they're going to file. And I thought that's such an interesting concept to try to counteract implicit bias. And I thought, is there any way that I could do that on the bench? And I thought of one way, of course, I can't do that out in court, but I thought maybe if I'm reading a motion and I worked with my judicial assistant to keep the name and any identifying information, could I read motions in a way that it was blind to myself so that I wasn't influenced in any form or fashion by the characteristics of the people and the defendant and the victims in the motions in front of me? That's one creative way I thought about trying to safeguard against any implicit bias I may have. And in terms of what I have done to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in my legal community or in the judicial system, this is something I've been working at extensively for years and years. And I serve on my office's racial justice committee, or I served on that committee before I decided to run. Part of that committee, we examined what we could do to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in our office. I came up with a particularized training that we did for 12 months where we tried.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And next up is Ryan Dibble, and your time begins now.
Thank you. That's a very pertinent topic, and just as everyone else has said, I do believe that everyone has implicit biases, and luckily now, including in the DA's office, we're receiving training on it. There are certain laws that are evolving, and so we're all, it's incumbent on all of us as parties to criminal cases, and ultimately on the bench to be aware that this exists. I've seen the impacts of implicit bias and bias as a DA, just some of the assumptions that people make about folks, whether they're the accused or victims or witnesses who are brought to court. A lot of times I've even seen that people that I'm interacting with who make assumptions about, me being a prosecutor, and, that if they don't show up to court in response to a subpoena, that I'm going to, automatically, ask to put them in jail, or that I don't understand, what a victim is dealing with because their experiences in the community and having suffered from a crime are different from my own. So, I have in my career really worked hard to, put myself in the shoes of different folks who have different life experience than me. I have never been the victim of violent crime, but I have convinced and talked to and counseled many victims of violent crime and witnesses to crime who are afraid to come to court to go along with the process for reasons where I'm kind of meeting them halfway. I'm not just asking them to come to court, because that's what I'm interested in doing for the case. I'm doing it in a way where I want them to feel comfortable. So I think that, I've had to work around a lot of those issues that have come up. And as a judge, I think it would be incumbent upon me to be aware of my own implicit bias. Again, from where I grew up and went to college, there's going to be many, many people that come into court who have different life experiences. And so we have to constantly be vigilant to know that, there are things that we're not even thinking about that, might factor into a decision. It's not cool. We need to really take the time to address that potential and make the best, most objective decision possible, knowing that people come from different walks of life. I feel that I've been well trained and have the experience and human skills to be able to do that, just with my experience interacting with so many different members of the public in my job. In terms of what I've done to increase equity and inclusion in our legal community, just taking the time with the witnesses and victims of crime that I interact with on a daily basis to explain to them what's going on in the court and to put it in human terms, no matter who a person is or what their education level is or background, that, everyone deserves to understand why they're in court. If they're a victim of crime or a witness to something, they're there unwittingly. And I've always tried to just make people feel welcome in the courtroom, welcome and participation, active participation in the process and be aware of what's going on. And I just feel like I'm an inclusive person that way, and that I have a good knack for explaining things in human terms. As a volunteer with Project Lead, I've also gone out in the community to try to teach fifth graders about, the criminal justice system and different aspects of peer pressure and things like that. And so, I always just try to increase people's knowledge about what's happening in court. So I'm cognizant of the fact that implicit bias exists. I think that's the key, is just everyone needs to know, so that they can, fine tune the way they make decisions in the way that's appropriate and expected in a court of law.
Thank you, and that is time. And now we'll have Renee, Yolande, and Chang, and your time starts now.
Hi. So as everyone said, we all have implicit biases, and we are formed by the various cultures and the life experiences that we have. And I think that what we need to do is not deny it, but recognize it and not act on it and try to take it out. But I want to talk about how it affects not only the accused, people who are accused of crimes, but it affects victims of crimes. We all have implicit biases against victims of crimes for certain things. For example, I am the supervisor of a unit that prosecutes sexual assault and domestic violence cases. And I have seen over the years, especially women from minority groups, Latino groups, members of the API community, they don't often come and report these crimes, not the first time, not the second time, not the third time it happens. And when they eventually do come to report these crimes, one of the things that we have to overcome in court is this bias against these victims, because, well, if this person had beat them all these times, why did they keep going back? If this person, if their spouse had raped them all these times, why did they keep going back? Why did they never say anything? So these are something that we are constantly dealing with in my unit, and we are constantly trying to help these victims be heard in court, and we have to overcome these, not just with the courts or the judges, but with the juries as well. So I deal with this every day. As a judge, of course, I would continue to take training, as I do in the DA's office, regarding implicit bias to make sure that it doesn't impact me in any of my decisions. And I would continue to do so if I'm elected to the bench. As far as increasing diversity, equity, inclusion in our legal community, I've also participated in Project LEAD, which involves members from our office going into underrepresented areas and schools and teaching fifth graders about the justice system and the judicial system and about decision making. I am also a supervisor, and I mentor young attorneys of different races, different genders, and I try to help them advance their career within the judicial system. I've worked with law clerks and mentored law clerks as well. And again, coming around to a victim perspective, victim-based approach, I also participate in these community groups, specifically the sexual assault response team in the South Bay where I work, where we have community advocacy groups for these underrepresented groups and minorities. Oops, have I been cut off? Is that my time?
Well, no, I apologize. You have a minute left.
That's okay. I'll finish it with that. So I have done a lot within the community and within the legal community to help promote diversity, as well as being a diverse candidate myself, being a female Asian candidate, but I'm not running simply on that. I am running also as the most qualified in my seat.
Thank you so much to all of our candidates. And now we have some time for questions. And just a reminder to anybody in our breakout room, if you have any questions, you can add them to the chat. And then we'll go ahead and do a reverse roundtable, about a minute each for a quick question here, just as we wrap up our time. Does anybody have any questions to add to the chat or live as well? And if not, I will allow each candidate to provide a closing statement, 1 minute on this topic or as a whole And we'll start in reverse order. And so Renee, you can go first.
Thank you. As I said, I've been working in the criminal court system for 27 years, and my other candidates in my seat have also been working in the court system for a long time. But I have the endorsements of the Metropolitan News Enterprise, which is the legal newspaper covering the courts in Los Angeles County. I have the highest rated LACBA rating, which was well qualified, against 2 of my competitors who are rated not qualified and 2 who are rated qualified. I have the endorsement of over 60 Superior Court judges, many of whom are former public defenders with whom I actually tried cases against. And these people represent me, and these entities represent me because they know I am fair, and I will be a fair and impartial judge. And I have the support of law enforcement and a victim advocacy group, Crime Survivors PAC. And I believe that based on my experience, based on my background, I will be the best candidate. And I thank you for your time, and I ask you for your support.
Thank you. And now we have Ryan.
All right, thank you very much. On this topic, I can't stress enough that in my role as a prosecutor, I've really, tried to improve my own skills in terms of being able to put myself in the shoes of people whose lived experience is different from mine, people who look different from me, people who grew up in different area, have a different education, whatever the case might be. I'm somebody who recognizes that both as a prosecutor and ultimately as a judge, I'm going to have to do that because that's how a fair assessment of the cases that will come into court is going to take place. The law tries to be objective with the application of the law and its fairness, but in order to understand people and why they might be in the system, or why to understand someone's fear of testifying or something like that, a judge does have to be in a position to understand different life experience. And so, it'll be incumbent upon me to be able to understand that as a judge.
Next, we have Elizabeth.
Thanks so much. I can't stress how important it is to have judges on the bench that have a deep understanding and also a commitment to overcoming their own implicit bias before they occupy such an important position. My commitment to overcoming racism and doing anti-racism work and doing implicit bias training and work is deep and long-standing. It began 25 years ago when I was in college and I traveled to South and studied colonialism and oppression. And it has traveled from that point until today. In the fall, I visited the Equal Justice Initiatives from Enslavement to Incarceration Museum. I visited the Lynching Memorial. That was my second trip there because I think that if you are going to work in the legal system and you are especially going to be on the bench making those important decisions, it is critical that you understand the history of the legal system and the racism that it is rooted in and work hard to overcome that. Just on my off time. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now we have Carolyn, and your time begins now.
In light of recent events, we know that perspective and values are just as, if not more important than qualifications in judges and judicial candidates. And my perspective and my values are informed by my lived experience as a Korean American woman in America. My perspective is also informed by being a community lawyer who has represented people from all walks of life, from all of all races, abilities, income, genders, sexual orientation. And that is the critical difference between me and the other candidates in my race.
Kind. Thank you, Carolyn. And last but not least, we have Carol for your final statement.
Thank you. As I've indicated, I've been on the bench for 30 years, and LA County is such a diverse community. By diverse, it's diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, agnostic, diverse in terms of sexual orientation, diverse in terms of wealth, not wealth, citizenship, immigrant, and the like. And when we talk about implicit bias, those are biases as well, or biases as well. And I've served all of those people, and I continue to serve those people, and I'm constantly mindful both of my own implicit biases, and I take all that in consideration. I do my best to take all of that in consideration each and every time, because when I see the scales of justice, they need to be balanced. Absolutely need to be balanced. And so I try to be mindful of that in each and every decision I make. And I ask myself, am I treating this person differently because of this, that, or the other? And I do the best of my ability to try and be fair and impartial to everyone who appears before this court, because I want that person to feel that when he or she or they walk out of the courtroom, that they were treated fairly. So that the next case that is identical to that case, factually speaking or criminal history wise, that they were treated fairly.
Thank you, and that is time. A huge thank you to all our candidates for your time. We will go back into the main room shortly.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone was able to get a lot out of tonight's program. And on behalf of the Junior League of Long Beach and the League of Women Voters, we'd like to thank you for attending tonight's forum and learning more about the judicial candidates. We will follow up with all of the attendees via email with the linked videos of tonight's forum when they are posted and made available to the public. Please feel free to share with your friends, family, and professional networks. I'd also like to give a special thanks to all of our judicial candidates tonight for joining, and I hope you found this to be fruitful. I know there's not a lot of these types of forums for judicial candidates, and so we're very excited that you were all able to join us. Please follow us on social media. You can visit jllb.org to learn more about the Junior League of Long Beach and lwv.org to learn more about the League of Women Voters. And again, thank you all so much for attending. We hope you have a wonderful evening.